Ava had always imagined that moving into a new neighborhood would be a fresh start. Her mother had promised her that this time, things would be better, quieter, safer, normal. After the chaos of the last few years, a sleepy suburban cul-de-sac seemed like exactly what they needed. Their new house was small but tidy, with white shutters and a porch swing that creaked gently in the breeze. Ava spent the first few weeks unpacking, helping her mom paint the kitchen and trying to get used to her new school. The neighbors mostly kept to themselves, offering polite waves or tight smiles when they passed on their morning walks. Everything felt predictable, even a little dull. That is, until she noticed Caleb. He lived next door in the house with the always perfect lawn and the wind chimes that clinked in the evenings. He wasn't what she expected. Most of the neighbors were either elderly couples or families with noisy toddlers. Caleb was different. He looked to be in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with neat hair and calm eyes. He always seemed put together, like someone from a movie about the suburbs. When Ava first saw him, he was watering his plants, humming softly to himself. He noticed her standing on her porch and gave a small nod. She nodded back, not thinking much of it. The first real interaction happened a week later. Ava had stayed late at school for a group project, and by the time she got home, her phone was dead. She realized too late that she'd left her house keys inside. Her mother wouldn't be home for hours, and she had no way to contact her. She sat on the porch, arms wrapped around her knees, trying not to panic. That's when Caleb appeared. He didn't make her feel uneasy then. He smiled gently, asked if everything was okay, and when she explained, he offered to let her wait at his place. At first, she hesitated. But he seemed kind, harmless, like an older cousin or an uncle's friend. So she followed him inside. His house was clean and smelled like sandalwood and coffee. He gave her a soda, told her she could watch TV if she wanted. The room was quiet but not in a tense way. They talked about harmless things, school, books, music. Caleb listened intently, nodding at the right times. He didn't interrupt or zone out like most adults. He laughed at her jokes, complimented her taste in music. For a girl who had always felt overlooked, it was flattering. She stayed until her mother called, apologizing profusely for being late. Ava thanked Caleb and left, not thinking the interaction meant anything. But that one visit turned into several. Every time she passed by his porch, he'd wave. Sometimes if he was outside when she came home from school, he'd offer her a cold drink or ask about her day. When her mom worked late, Ava found herself wandering over. At first, they just talked. He had stories, advice, insights about life that made her feel older. She started to look forward to those conversations. He never made her feel stupid or childish. In fact, he often said how mature she was, how insightful for her age. It was easy to believe him. At school, no one really listened to her. At home, her mom was always tired. With Caleb, she felt seen. The text started slowly. It began when she mentioned a band she liked, and he messaged her a link to a live version of their song. Then a funny meme. Then an article. Soon, they were texting every day. Sometimes late into the night. He always asked questions, thoughtful ones, and responded quickly, like he was really paying attention. It didn't feel weird at the time. He wasn't like the boys at school who only texted to gossip or flirt or waste time. Caleb's messages felt meaningful. She told herself that this wasn't anything strange. He was just a neighbor. A lonely adult. Someone who needed company. Still, something inside her shifted. She stopped telling her friends about the conversations. She deleted some of the messages, not because they were inappropriate, but because she didn't want to explain them. She started dressing more carefully when she walked outside, brushing her hair before checking the mail. If Caleb was outside, she lingered. If he wasn't, she felt oddly disappointed. And all the while, she told herself that it was just friendship. He wasn't crossing any lines. He never touched her. He never said anything overtly suggestive. But there was a charge beneath the surface, one she was too young to name, but old enough to feel. Over time, Caleb grew more open. He'd talk about his wife, how they were growing apart, how she didn't understand him. He'd say how refreshing it was to talk to someone who wasn't constantly judging or dismissive. Ava would nod, unsure what to say, but secretly pleased to be trusted. He told her she was different. Special. That she had an old soul. He said she was more grounded than most adults he knew. Sometimes when she laughed, he'd just watch her with this expression she couldn't quite decode. It wasn't exactly inappropriate. But it wasn't neutral either. The air around them became thick with implication. Still, he didn't make a move. And Ava, in her heart, clung to that as proof that nothing was wrong. If anything, she started to feel guilty for even suspecting otherwise. After all, he was kind. He had never pressured her. He gave her books, made her tea, asked about her dreams. Wasn't that what adults were supposed to do? Mentor teenagers? Guide them? But something changed the night of the storm. It was a Friday, and the sky had turned a bruised shade of purple. Rain pounded the roof, wind rattled the windows. Her mother was working a night shift, and the power went out around 9 p.m. Ava was curled up on the couch when her phone buzzed. It was Caleb. He asked if she was okay. When she replied yes, he said he had power and candles, and if she was scared or cold, she was welcome to come over. At first, she said no. But half an hour later, the dark silence of her house began to feel suffocating. She told herself it was just for a little while. She knocked on his door, and he opened it like he'd been waiting. The living room was glowing with candles. There was soft music playing. She sat on the couch, sipping hot chocolate, and tried not to notice how quiet it was. Or how close he was sitting. He asked if she wanted to talk. She nodded. But what followed wasn't the usual conversation. His questions were softer, more intimate. He asked about boys at school, about whether she ever felt like no one really got her. Then he said that he did. That he got her. She smiled nervously. He touched her hand. It wasn't until then that she realized something had shifted and there was no turning back. Ava sat frozen on Caleb's couch, her fingers still faintly trembling around the warm mug in her hands. The silence between them thickened, turning into something almost physical, like a wall slowly pressing inward. The room no longer felt cozy. The candlelight that once flickered gently now cast strange, elongated shadows on the walls, making everything appear distorted and unfamiliar. She stared at the soft pattern of the carpet, trying to focus on anything that wasn't the fact that Caleb's hand was still lightly resting on top of hers. It wasn't a grip. It wasn't forceful. But it also wasn't casual. It was too intentional, too still. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to pull away without making it awkward, or worse, offending him. So she stayed still, silent, waiting for the moment to pass. But it didn't. He continued talking soft, low-voiced sentences that blurred together. She couldn't recall exactly what he was saying. Something about understanding her, about how rare it was to find someone so emotionally intelligent at her age. Something about connection, about timing, about fate. The words were gentle, but they pressed on her like weights, heavy with subtext she hadn't invited. He leaned slightly closer. Not enough to make a clear move, but enough to break the invisible boundary that had once existed between them. She nodded along, unsure what her face was doing, unsure whether she looked calm or scared or polite or confused. Her whole body felt disconnected, like she was watching herself from across the room. When the storm outside softened into a steady drizzle and the clock in the hallway struck midnight, she finally stood up. Caleb walked her to the door. He didn't touch her again, but the feeling of his hand stayed with her. Long after she got home, long after she changed into pajamas and crawled into bed, she could still feel it. Not just the physical touch, but the moment itself, the electricity of it, the tension, the fact that he had crossed a line so subtly she didn't even know how to explain it. The following days were quiet. Ava avoided going outside when she could. She didn't respond to Caleb's texts right away. When she did, she kept her answers short and distant. He didn't push, but he noticed. The tone of his messages shifted, less warm, more curious. He asked if she was okay, if he'd said something wrong. He hoped she knew how much their friendship meant to him. Then silence for 2 days. Then another message, longer this time, about how he'd been thinking of her and hoping she hadn't misunderstood him. She didn't know how to respond. Deep down, she had known something was wrong that night. But at the same time, there was still a part of her that didn't want to believe it. A part of her that still remembered the comfort, the feeling of being seen, the sense that someone in this world actually cared about her. She didn't want to lose that, even if it came from someone she was starting to fear. So slowly, cautiously, she responded. Less frequently, but still enough to keep the connection from fading. Enough to avoid angering him. Enough to keep him calm. What followed was a strange, drawn-out balancing act. Ava learned how to say just enough to avoid suspicion. How to give polite replies without opening the door too far. But Caleb seemed to sense the shift in her. He started appearing more often, outside when she got home, at the grocery store with casual excuses, even once parked outside her school when she walked to the gate. Every time she saw him, she smiled tightly, her stomach tightening into knots. Every time he said something kind or gave her a small gift, a book, a candle, a necklace she didn't ask for, she thanked him, even when it made her skin crawl. It became clear to her that Caleb didn't think he had done anything wrong. In fact, it almost seemed like he believed he was the victim, misunderstood, unappreciated, lonely. He framed their connection like a secret garden, a place where they could be their true selves away from judgmental eyes. He spoke in riddles and metaphors, making everything sound poetic and harmless. But behind every word was an unspoken threat. If she pulled away, if she cut him off, there would be consequences. He never said it outright, but she felt it in every message, every lingering look, every unexpected appearance. Then one afternoon, something snapped. It was after school. Her mom had gone to pick up groceries and Ava had the house to herself. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when her phone buzzed. It was Caleb. He had sent a photo. A selfie of him standing outside her house, smiling. She looked out the window and saw no one. Her heart thudded against her ribs. The timestamp on the message was from 10 minutes earlier. He'd been there. Watching. Not knocking, not texting a greeting, just watching. She didn't respond. She turned off her phone and closed the blinds. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the house settling, the wind brushing against the siding, the rustle of tree branches. She imagined him standing just outside her window, waiting for her to acknowledge him. To come out. To return the attention he believed he deserved. The next morning she woke up to a long message. It was apologetic but also accusing. Caleb wrote that he was worried about her. That she had become distant. That he felt like she was ashamed of their connection. He reminded her of all the things he had done for her, the books, the advice, the late-night talks. He said he had been patient. That he had waited for her to come to terms with her feelings. That he knew she cared, even if she was scared to admit it. And then came the line that made her throat close. If you push me away, I'll have no choice but to tell your mom what you've been doing. The words sat on her screen, pulsing with danger. He framed it as concern, as honesty, as a desperate plea, but Ava knew better. It was blackmail. A threat. An attempt to control her through fear. Her hands trembled as she read it again and again. He wasn't just implying things anymore. He was ready to weaponize the months of conversations, the texts, the small touches. Ready to make her look like the one who started it. Ava felt the ground shift beneath her. The connection she once thought was complicated but innocent was now unmistakably toxic. She could see the full picture now, not a lonely man who misunderstood boundaries, but a manipulator who had carefully constructed a trap around her, step by step. And now he was holding the door closed, daring her to try and escape. She didn't know what to do. Every option felt dangerous. If she told her mother, would she believe her? If she ignored him, would he follow through on his threat? If she tried to reason with him, would that only give him more power? She sat alone in her room, the walls closing in, her phone buzzing again and again with new messages she didn't dare open. Outside, the neighborhood looked calm and sunny, kids riding bikes, sprinklers dancing across lawns. But inside Ava's world, the storm had only just begun. Ava barely ate for days. Every sound outside made her flinch, every notification on her phone sent her pulse skyrocketing. She stopped opening texts from Caleb entirely, but even the unread messages felt like poison in her pocket. She deleted some, then regretted it, then stared at her empty inbox like it was evidence she just destroyed. She was caught in a loop of fear and self-doubt, replaying everything that had happened over the past few months and wondering how she had let it go this far. She remembered the first time he smiled at her, the first time he complimented her drawings, the way he always seemed to know when she needed someone to talk to. At the time it had felt like comfort. But now it all looked like calculation, each moment part of a larger pattern she had been too young and too lonely to see. She started staying late at school. She found excuses to be out of the house. Her mom noticed but didn't push. Ava said it was stress from midterms. In truth, she couldn't stand being in the same space for too long, couldn't sit near the windows where he might see her. She felt eyes on her constantly. Even when she couldn't see him, she imagined he was somewhere nearby, waiting to catch her alone. The paranoia was exhausting. She kept her curtains shut. She stopped going outside unless absolutely necessary. When she passed him on the street, which happened more than she liked, she pretended not to see him. But he always smiled, always gave that little nod, the one that once seemed warm but now sent chills up her spine. He never confronted her again outright. But he didn't need to. His silence was more threatening than any message. He was letting her feel the tension, letting her imagine what he might do, how he might twist the story if he wanted to. And that silence began to fill every part of her life. She couldn't concentrate in class. Her grades slipped. She avoided her friends, terrified one of them might mention something strange they'd heard or ask why she seemed so distant. Her phone was constantly in her hand, not because she wanted to use it, but because she needed to be prepared for a new threat, for a call from her mother, for some kind of sign that things might get worse. Then one afternoon in the school library, her body finally gave up. She was hunched over a book, eyes heavy, brain foggy from days of no real sleep, when her vision blurred and her chest tightened. Her breathing quickened without warning. Her hands started shaking. The walls felt like they were collapsing inward. She clutched the edge of the table, trying to steady herself, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She stumbled out of her chair and collapsed to her knees in the quiet corner between two shelves. A few students noticed, and within moments a teacher was by her side, asking if she was okay. She nodded. She shook her head. She didn't know what to say. The school nurse came. They walked her to the office, offered her water, told her to breathe. She mumbled something about stress, about not sleeping. She didn't tell the whole truth, but something in her expression must have cracked because the counselor was called in. Ava didn't want to talk. She didn't want to explain. But then the counselor asked one question she wasn't expecting. Had anyone made her feel unsafe lately? That question broke something open. Not everything came out at once. At first it was fragments. A neighbor. Unwanted attention. Messages that made her uncomfortable. She didn't use names. She kept her voice low. But the counselor didn't push for details. She just listened. And Ava, for the first time in weeks, didn't feel like she was spiraling alone. They spoke for nearly an hour. By the end, the counselor gently told her that what she'd described sounded serious, and that she wasn't to blame for any of it. She explained that Ava wasn't alone, and that what had happened wasn't just inappropriate, it was wrong. Manipulative. A violation of boundaries and trust. Later that day, her mother was called in. Ava sat in the counselor's office, shaking, while her mom arrived. At first, her mother's face was unreadable, concerned, yes, but also confused. As Ava began to speak, the truth clumsy and tangled on her tongue, her mother's expression shifted. First disbelief, then dawning realization, and finally something fierce and protective. There were tears on both sides, but no yelling, no accusations. Just a long, heavy silence when it was all out in the open. That evening, everything changed. The police were called. Ava gave a statement. The messages on her phone, screenshots she had managed to save, were reviewed. The details were hard to say out loud, harder still to admit had actually happened. She felt exposed and humiliated, but also strangely lighter, like a weight had started to lift, even if only slightly. The officers were patient. Her mom sat beside her the whole time. When it was over, they said they'd be following up soon. The next morning, Caleb's house was quiet. His car was still in the driveway, but his blinds were closed. Ava didn't know if he had any idea what was coming. She didn't care. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted it to stop. She wanted to stop waking up with dread in her chest, to stop checking her phone like it might explode, to stop scanning crowds for his face. Most of all, she wanted to feel like a kid again, like someone who hadn't been dragged into something too dark and too complicated for her age. Over the next few days, word began to spread. Not publicly yet, but she knew some teachers were aware. Her principal called her in and offered support. Her counselor checked in daily. Her mother barely let her out of her sight. And though Ava hated the attention, a small part of her was grateful. For the first time, someone else was carrying the fear with her. Eventually, the police returned. Caleb had been brought in for questioning. They told Ava they were building a case, that there had been similar reports in the past, although none had ever resulted in charges. This time, they said, might be different. This time, they had evidence. Ava didn't know how to feel. She wasn't ready to feel hope. But she no longer felt entirely powerless. Every day was still a struggle. She couldn't erase the memories. Couldn't unfeel the fear. But she started going outside again. Started talking to her friends again, though she didn't tell them everything. She went back to drawing. She listened to music that didn't remind her of him. She slept with the blinds open one night, just to see the stars again. And though she didn't fully believe it yet, she started whispering the thought to herself at night, just once, before closing her eyes. Maybe it's going to be okay. Maybe the worst part is over. The days that followed blurred into a slow, uneasy rhythm. Ava woke each morning with a mix of dread and numbness, as though her body had learned to anticipate fear even before her mind was fully awake. The relief of having told someone was real, but it came tangled with new fears: fear of being judged, of being doubted, of what would happen next. Her phone became a symbol of both power and panic. She had saved screenshots, recorded voice notes, collected every piece of the past few months that she could salvage. These small digital fragments were all that remained of the confusion, the manipulation, and the slow erosion of her trust. Now they were evidence. But they also felt like reminders of how deeply she'd been pulled into something she had never consented to be part of. At school, she moved like a shadow of herself. Her teachers treated her gently, almost cautiously, but few asked questions. The ones who knew kept their distance in a way that felt respectful but still isolating. Her friends sensed a shift, though she hadn't shared the truth with any of them. When they asked if she was okay, she always said she was tired. Most of them believed her. Some didn't, but none pushed. She appreciated that more than she could say. The idea of explaining it, of putting the whole twisted story into words, still felt impossible. And anyway, how could she make them understand? They'd never met Caleb. They didn't know how something that looked so normal on the outside could be so wrong behind closed doors. At home, her mother hovered. Not overbearing, but present in a way she hadn't been before. Dinners became quiet routines. There were long silences, but they weren't cold, just heavy. Ava could see the worry in her mother's face, the way she flinched whenever the doorbell rang, how her voice changed when she answered the phone. For years, her mom had worked long shifts and come home exhausted, too tired to notice how quiet Ava had become. Now every glance seemed filled with regret. She didn't say it out loud, but Ava could feel it in the way her mother lingered at the doorway before bed, or how she sometimes checked if the windows were locked more than once. One afternoon, an officer called. Caleb had been released pending further investigation, but there were restrictions in place. He was not allowed to contact Ava. He could not come near her home, her school, or her usual places. Her mother had taken out a protective order. Ava thanked the officer in a flat voice and hung up, staring at the floor for several minutes afterward. The idea of him still being out there, just across the fence, made her stomach tighten. She hadn't seen him since the police visit. His house looked abandoned, blinds drawn, porch empty. No lights at night. No movement. But she could feel his presence like a pressure in the air. Every creak of wood, every passing car, every dog barking in the distance sent her pulse climbing. At night, she sometimes dreamed of him standing at the edge of her bed, just watching. Despite it all, she started journaling. At first, the entries were chaotic, just fragments of thoughts, disconnected words, pieces of conversations she remembered and couldn't forget. Over time, they became more structured. She wrote what had happened, not just the events but how she had felt. She wrote about the confusion, the guilt, the need for attention that had been so easily exploited. She wrote about how careful he had been, how soft his tone had always been, how easily he had blurred the line between kindness and control. Through the act of writing, she started to understand what she couldn't explain aloud, that he had never needed to be violent to be dangerous. He had used affection as a weapon, trust as a cage. The school counselor continued to meet with her weekly. In those sessions, Ava learned the language for what had happened to her. Grooming, coercion, manipulation, abuse of power. Each word was a small shift in how she saw herself, not as a foolish girl who'd let something happen, but as a teenager who had been deliberately targeted by an adult who knew exactly what he was doing. That reframing didn't take the pain away, but it gave it context. And that context made room for something that had felt completely out of reach before: self-forgiveness. She also learned how common it was. The counselor gave her articles, stories from others, testimonials from survivors who had gone through similar experiences. It was overwhelming but also grounding. She wasn't broken. She wasn't the only one. There was a whole world of people who had been tricked by people they trusted, people who looked safe and sounded kind. That truth stung, but it also brought clarity. What had happened to her wasn't love. It wasn't special. It was a pattern. And recognizing that pattern was the first step in breaking it. Still, the healing wasn't linear. Some days were okay. She smiled at something on TV. She went outside without flinching. She listened to music without immediately being reminded of Caleb. Other days, she struggled to get out of bed. She replayed conversations, wondering if she had somehow invited it. She stared at old texts and tried to figure out when exactly the line had been crossed. Her mind became a courtroom, endlessly reviewing evidence, looking for blame. But slowly over weeks, that inner trial grew quieter. Then came the moment she hadn't anticipated. A detective called with an update. They had spoken to others, 2 women, now adults, who had known Caleb as teenagers. Their stories were different but echoed the same disturbing pattern. Nothing had ever been proven back then. But now with Ava's evidence, the case was stronger. Charges were being filed. There would be a hearing. She might have to testify. The thought terrified her. The idea of standing in front of strangers and recounting everything in detail made her stomach churn. But something else began to rise in her too, a quiet strength. A sense of purpose. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for every girl who had felt too scared to speak, for the ones who had been dismissed or silenced or gaslit into believing they had imagined it all. She had evidence. She had her voice. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. In the days leading up to the hearing, she practiced her testimony with her counselor. She reviewed her notes, recounted the timeline, described how the relationship had evolved. She was encouraged to speak plainly, to be honest about what she had felt. No embellishment. No dramatics. Just truth. Her truth. When the day came, she wore simple clothes and tied her hair back. Her mother sat beside her the entire time. In the courtroom, she saw Caleb for the first time in weeks. He looked smaller somehow, hunched eyes darting. Not the composed, charming neighbor she had once known, but a man cornered by consequences. When she spoke, her voice shook at first. But with each sentence it grew steadier. She talked about the first conversations, the growing attention, the slow descent into fear. She talked about the threats, the way he used silence and suggestion to control her. She told the truth, not to destroy him, but to free herself. And when she stepped down, she felt a strange, unfamiliar weight lift from her chest. She didn't know what the verdict would be. But she had spoken. She had faced him. And that in itself was a kind of victory. That night, she sat on her porch for the first time in months. The sky was clear. A breeze moved gently through the trees. The street was quiet, just the occasional flicker of headlights from a passing car. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid of it. The weeks after the hearing unfolded in a haze of waiting, uncertainty, and cautious recovery. Ava tried to return to a version of her old life, though nothing about her felt the same anymore. School resumed its usual rhythm, but she moved through it differently, quieter, more watchful, as if some internal sensor had been permanently switched on. She no longer felt invisible, but neither did she want to be seen. Every time someone glanced at her a beat too long, she wondered if they knew. Wondered if they'd read the local report, if they'd piece things together. Some students looked at her differently, but no one said anything directly. Teachers offered subdued encouragement. Friends asked gentle questions. The world hadn't moved on, but it was moving, and Ava was learning how to move with it. She started running in the mornings. Not for fitness, not even for routine, but for the rhythm of her feet against the pavement, the way her breath evened out as her body fell into motion. It gave her a sense of control, something tangible in a time when so much had been taken from her. She'd wake up early, lace her shoes in the dim blue of dawn, and follow the same quiet route through side streets and shaded sidewalks. For those 30 or 40 minutes, her mind cleared. The fear still lived inside her, but it loosened its grip. She didn't run from something anymore. She ran to remember what freedom felt like. Her mother adjusted too. Their relationship was far from perfect, but there was a new honesty between them, one that hadn't existed before. They talked more, even if it was just about small things: homework, groceries, a TV show. The silence that had once settled so easily between them now felt more like space for breathing than avoidance. Sometimes Ava caught her mom watching her with a look of quiet grief, as if mourning not just what had happened, but the version of her daughter that might never return. Ava understood that. She sometimes mourned that girl too, the one who didn't question kindness, who believed adults were safe by default, who thought love was always something clean and warm. Therapy became a constant. It was hard, often draining, but it also gave her something to hold on to. She was learning that trauma didn't move in a straight line. There were days when she felt strong, like she could take on the world. And then there were days when brushing her hair or answering a text message felt like monumental tasks. She learned to stop apologizing for those days. Learned to stop measuring her healing by how productive she was or how happy she appeared. Recovery, she realized, wasn't about becoming who she was before, it was about becoming someone new, someone who could carry what had happened without being defined by it. One afternoon, while scrolling through an old folder on her phone, she found a photo she'd forgotten. It was from months ago, before everything shifted. She was sitting on her porch, legs curled beneath her, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. The sunlight was soft, her expression unguarded. For a moment, she stared at the image in silence. That girl looked like her, but also didn't. She seemed lighter. And yet, Ava didn't wish to go back. That moment wasn't real anymore, not entirely. And maybe that was okay. Maybe some things weren't meant to be reclaimed. They were meant to be remembered, then let go. News of the case started to spread more formally. Caleb's arrest was public now. Local outlets picked up the story. Headlines appeared online: former youth mentor accused of inappropriate contact with minor. The articles didn't name Ava, but she knew people were guessing. Her town wasn't large. Whispers spread quickly. She braced herself for backlash but was surprised when some of her classmates began reaching out, not to question her, but to share their own stories. A girl in her history class sent her a message saying she had once felt uncomfortable around him too. Another girl said she was proud of Ava for speaking up. A boy she barely knew nodded at her in the hallway with a quiet kind of respect. It was strange, having people look at her and see something brave. She didn't feel brave. She felt exhausted. But maybe bravery wasn't about feeling strong. Maybe it was just about choosing to keep going, even when you were afraid. She hadn't told her story to be inspiring. She told it because silence had become unbearable. Still, knowing that someone else might feel less alone because of it, that meant something. The court date approached slowly and then all at once. Ava didn't know what to expect. She imagined cold rooms, sharp questions, Caleb's eyes on her across the room. But when the day arrived, she walked into the courthouse with her mother's hand in hers, her head high. She sat in a chair, listened to the lawyer speak, and when she was called to testify again, she stood and walked to the stand with steady steps. She told the truth again, and this time it came easier. Her voice was stronger. She no longer second-guessed herself. Caleb's lawyer tried to minimize everything, framing it as a misunderstanding, a series of misinterpreted gestures. But Ava didn't flinch. She answered every question. She stated the facts. She didn't let the shame creep back in. And when she stepped down from the witness stand, the judge gave her a brief look, neutral but respectful. The trial moved forward and days later a verdict was reached. Guilty on multiple counts. Sentencing would come next. When Ava heard the word guilty spoken aloud, something inside her loosened. She hadn't expected it to feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like a door finally closing. The relief wasn't joyful, it was quiet, still, like standing in an empty room where an alarm had finally stopped ringing. She knew he would be gone now, at least for a while. She wouldn't see him outside her window. He wouldn't message her. He wouldn't twist her words or her memories. The nightmare had been real, but it had ended in the light. Months passed. Seasons changed. Spring melted into summer. The world moved on, but Ava didn't forget. She started volunteering at a community center for girls. Nothing dramatic, just helping with art classes, organizing supplies, listening when someone needed to talk. She didn't share her story unless asked, and even then, only pieces. But the girls seemed to sense something in her, a quiet strength, a calm that came from having endured. They asked her for advice, not because she was an adult, but because she didn't talk down to them. She listened. One girl, only 13, once stayed after class and asked her how to know if someone was safe. Ava took a breath before answering. She didn't say too much. She just said that real safety never made you feel like you owed someone anything. That love never came with fear. That your body and your mind were always yours and no one had the right to take them. Later that night, she wrote those words down. Folded the paper and put it in her journal. There were still bad nights. She still startled when men stood too close, still sometimes replayed old conversations she wished she had ended sooner. But she also laughed again. Sang in the shower. Painted on her bedroom floor with music blasting. She learned to trust her instincts again slowly. She made new friends. She watched the sunrise from her porch without looking over her shoulder. One day she opened her journal and flipped back to the beginning, the entries full of confusion, of fear, of trying to make sense of a relationship that had never been safe. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just read. Then she turned to a blank page and began to write something new. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had one. And she knew that whatever came next, it would be on her terms. Not shaped by fear or silence or someone else's control, but by her voice, her choices, her strength. The story she had lived through had nearly broken her. But it hadn't. She had survived it. And that, she knew now, was its own kind of power. The summer passed in a slow, golden stretch of heat and quiet hours. Ava moved through it gently, like someone relearning the texture of peace. Her world had changed so completely in the last year that the return to ordinary things, sunlight through her bedroom curtains, the buzz of lawnmowers down the street, her mother's humming from the kitchen, felt surreal. For the first time in a long while, she was not waiting for something to go wrong. There were still echoes of fear that lived beneath the surface, shadows that sometimes crept in when she was alone too long or startled by a voice she didn't recognize, but they no longer ruled her. She had started to separate herself from the trauma, not by pretending it hadn't happened, but by refusing to let it define her every moment. She spent more time outside now. The porch that once felt like a vulnerable place, where she used to imagine eyes watching her from across the fence, became somewhere she could breathe again. She would sit there in the early mornings or late evenings, watching the neighborhood slowly stretch into its rhythms, kids on bikes, neighbors walking dogs, sprinklers arcing across green lawns. Everything had a kind of mundane beauty she hadn't noticed before. For so long, she had lived in a state of hyper-awareness, always scanning for danger. Now she was learning how to be present, to let herself simply exist without bracing for impact. Her relationship with her mother grew stronger in small, steady ways. They still didn't talk about everything, not all the time, but there was a softness between them that hadn't been there before. Sometimes they cooked together. Sometimes they just shared space, reading or cleaning or sitting in silence that wasn't heavy but companionable. Her mother had become her quiet anchor, firm, grounding, always nearby without pressing too hard. Ava had forgiven her, not because the past had vanished, but because she knew now that people miss things even when they loved you deeply. She saw the guilt in her mother's eyes sometimes, and instead of resenting it, she recognized it for what it was, a sign that healing wasn't hers alone. They were doing it together. Therapy continued through the summer. The sessions were less about crisis now and more about understanding. Ava was piecing her identity back together, sorting through the debris of what had happened and deciding what to keep, what to discard, and what to rebuild. Her therapist helped her name the things she had survived: grooming, manipulation, emotional blackmail, and helped her see the strength in how she had responded. There were still days when the memories hit hard, when the wrong phrase or scent could trigger a full-body reaction, but she had tools now. She knew how to ground herself. She knew how to breathe through it. And more than anything, she knew it would pass. Sometimes she still had dreams. Not always nightmares, but dreams where Caleb appeared, not as a monster but as the man she had once believed he was, the friendly neighbor, the warm voice, the person who made her feel understood. Those dreams unsettled her the most. They reminded her that the manipulation hadn't just happened to her body but to her mind, her emotions, her sense of what was real. But even in those dreams, something was different now. She could feel the wrongness sooner. She no longer felt trapped inside the illusion. Even asleep, her instincts had changed. She poured more of herself into art. Drawing had always been a quiet outlet, but now it became something closer to a language, a way to say things she couldn't yet speak. Her sketchbooks filled with fragmented scenes, portraits of girls with unreadable eyes, surreal landscapes with storm clouds that broke into sunlight. She didn't always know what the images meant, but creating them brought clarity, relief, even joy. She signed up for a local summer art class at the community center, and though she was nervous at first, she found comfort in the quiet focus of the room, in the soft scratch of pencils and the smell of paint. There she wasn't the girl from the news. She was just Ava, a teenager with a gift for color and a sharp, evolving eye. One afternoon, the instructor asked her to stay behind after class. She thought maybe she was in trouble, but instead, he handed her a brochure for a teen art showcase happening later in the summer. He encouraged her to submit her work. The idea terrified her. Sharing her art felt more intimate than speaking. But she took the brochure home, taped it above her desk, and stared at it every night for a week before deciding to enter. She chose 3 pieces, one older, too new, and mailed in her application. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of excitement about something ahead, not just relief about what was behind. Meanwhile, updates on Caleb's sentencing trickled in. He had been convicted on multiple charges, and though appeals were expected, he was being held in custody until sentencing was finalized. Ava didn't follow the legal details too closely anymore. She trusted the people handling it. She no longer checked the news for his name, no longer searched for signs of his presence in her world. Her mother kept tabs on the process, shared what Ava needed to know, and kept the rest to herself unless asked. It was a silent agreement between them, a line Ava had drawn to protect her peace, and her mother respected it. The day of the art showcase arrived in late July. Ava stood in front of her pieces, displayed on a long white wall with the work of 20 other teens. People walked past, pausing to look, tilting their heads, asking quiet questions. No one knew what the pieces meant unless she told them. That privacy felt like power. Her favorite of the three was a drawing of a girl standing alone in a field beneath a sky that was breaking apart, not stormy, but not clear either. The horizon was open. Infinite. Someone asked her what it was about. She said it was about surviving, about what it feels like to be standing in your own life again after forgetting you ever had one. When she got home that evening, there was a small envelope in the mailbox. It had no return address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. No threats, no accusations, just a single sentence in neat, familiar handwriting. I still think about you. Ava's hand tightened around the note. Her chest burned, not with fear this time, but with rage and a new, sharper kind of clarity. She tore the paper in half, then into quarters, and flushed it down the toilet. It was the last time she allowed him to enter her world in any form. That night, she wrote in her journal again. She didn't write about him. She didn't write about what he'd done. She wrote about the things he hadn't taken. Her voice. Her art. Her future. She wrote about the girls she had met at the community center. About the colors she wanted to try in her next painting. About the way her mother had hugged her before bed, not with caution, but with full, fierce love. She wrote about the stillness in her heart, not the absence of pain, but the presence of something steadier, something growing. She didn't know what next year would bring. She didn't know if she'd still flinch at sudden footsteps or avoid certain smells. But she knew she had changed. And not because of what happened to her, but because of what she had done with it. Because of who she had become in spite of it. The fear might always live somewhere inside her, but it didn't drive the car anymore. It sat in the back seat, small and quiet, while she steered toward whatever came next. She closed her journal, turned off the light, and lay in the dark. The window was open. The air smelled like cut grass and warm pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed, its low hum fading into the night. Ava listened. Breathed. Slept.